So I am Cheryl, and I teach or taught the craft and sewing classes at the main library, Kansas City, Kansas main library downtown. And now that we don't have anybody coming into the building anymore, I thought it might be nice to do this. And since there's a resurgence of people who are wanting to learn how to sew, because everybody's stuck at home and people want to make masks, and I'm addicted to making masks, frankly. And we're going to learn that in next week's class. So today I'm going to talk about fabric, tools, and basics of sewing and ironing and pressing. And there is a difference between ironing and pressing when it comes to sewing. Okay, start with the fabric. And we talked about this a little bit at the end of last week's class, and that was fibers versus material versus the weave of the material. So cotton is a fiber, and that can be made into lots of different weaves. They can weave it different ways to make it into different materials. So you can have a cotton satin, which is they call it sateen. You can have a cotton velvet. You can have a cotton chiffon. It's just how it's woven. But cotton is the fiber it's made of. Okay. And you really need to know what fibers you're using, because natural fibers can handle higher heat settings on your iron. And they breathe differently. If it's a synthetic like polyester, polyester is actually plastic and it doesn't breathe. So it may feel light and floaty and it may feel thin, but it's not going to breathe like it would if it was a cotton material or a natural material. Natural materials would be most common is cotton, wool, silk, and rayon is a weird kind of synthetic natural. It's a synthetic material in the fact that it's man-made, but it's natural in the fact that it's man-made, but it's made from wood pulp. So it is actually a plant material that is processed and made into a thread. So it breathes more like a natural material, but it can be slippery, kind of like a synthetic. And just let you know also, when you get your fabric, you should right away treat your fabric the same way that you would treat the finished item. If you're going to throw the finished item in your washing machine, then you put your fabric in the washing machine. If you're worried about the edges raveling, you can do a zigzag stitch along the edge so that it won't unravel before you throw it in the washing machine, but you do want to wash it. The reason is because when they weave fabric and they make it, they put special chemicals on there to help with the production. They call that sizing. They put sizing on there. And when you wash that off, the fibers can shrink a little bit, sometimes up to 10%. So you don't want to just take it home and cut it up and make it into something, because when you wash it, it's going to start shrinking. Okay, so wash it first. If it's like silk and you're going to take it to the dry cleaners, take the fabric, do zigzag over the edges so it doesn't unravel, but take the fabric, the whole bunch of fabric, take it to the dry cleaners. They will dry clean the fabric for you, and that will take off the extra sizing, and if it's going to shrink, it will shrink then. Honestly, I mostly throw my silk stuff in the washing machine on delicate and low. If you do that with silk, it will end up losing some of its shine. It will get a kind of a suede-like look to it, which I tend to like, and so I do that. But so treat it however you're going to treat the fabric. Now, there's some terminology when it comes to fabric. Oh, and how do you know? If you get fabric at Joann's or Hobby Lobby, it will say on the end of the roll of fabric, they call that a bolt, B-O-L-T, a bolt of fabric. It will say on the end what the material, they'll call it the content of it is. It'll say polyester or cotton spandex or something. Sometimes they add like a 5% spandex or lycra to make cotton a little stretchy. Okay. Now, some items, some terminology. When it comes to fabric, the edge of the fabric where it's woven is called the selvage. And I don't know if you can see that it's actually a woven edge, not cut. And that woven edge runs along the edges where it's on the loom when they weave it. So those are called the selvages. You have one on each side. Now, the fibers that run, this is the selvage here. The fibers that run parallel to that, that's called on the grain. That's called your grain line. The fibers that run this direction are called, that's called cross grain. If you're into weaving, this would be the warp and the weft. But if you're into sewing, they'll call this the grain direction, grain line, and they'll call this cross grain. You need to know this. It matters how you place the pattern pieces on your fabric. When you get a pattern and try and lay it out, they will have layouts to tell you which direction to put your pieces. And it makes a difference, because if you try and pull the fabric on the grain or the cross grain, it will not stretch. But if you pull it catty corner, watch when I pull it catty corner. See how that stretches? Cross catty corner is called the bias. And if you try to put, you will put pieces on the fabric this way, catty corner on the bias, if they need a little bit of stretchiness just in that one area. But for most parts, you'll put things straight up and down, and they'll have little lines with arrows on the pattern pieces that you align with the grain up and down along this, like along the selvage. Okay. All right. When you wash and dry clean your fabric, you will then iron it, because when you wash it or dry clean it, it will get wrinkles. And you do not want it to have wrinkles when you cut it out, because that will affect your edges. You can't get a straight line in your cuts if there's wrinkles in there. So frankly, I'd say 75% of sewing is preparation, not the actual physical sewing machine part. It's washing the fabric, ironing the fabric, laying out your pattern pieces, pinning them down, cutting them out, arranging them, pinning them together. Then you can sew. Then you have to iron. And when you sew something together, you will iron it or press it. There's a difference, actually, after each step. When you sew two pieces together, you sew it down, two pieces together, they call that a seam, just like the seam on your clothing. The distance away from the edge that you sew, they call that the seam allowance. And different patterns will call for different amounts of seam allowance, or stitching different lengths away from the edge. Okay. And ironing, when it comes to sewing, ironing is when you use the iron to get wrinkles out and you move it around like that. Pressing is when you set the seams, you set the sewing stitches into the seam, and then you open up the seams and flatten them out. That's called pressing. So ironing takes away the wrinkles. Pressing is to put in specific wrinkles, or flatten, your seams, so that they will stay flat and smooth and not bunch up. Okay. Okay, next thing I'm going to talk about is tools. And by the way, if you have a question, unmute yourself and just pop right up and ask the question. I honestly do not mind questions. And if you, we can learn a lot from me going on tangents by answering your questions. So if you have a question, just click in the bottom left-hand corner on the little microphone symbol and unmute yourself, and then ask the question. Okay, so tools. One of the most important tools is going to be your scissors. Now, invest in 1 or 2 good pairs of scissors. Nice, heavy ones that you keep sharp, and do not use these for anything else besides your sewing. For crying out loud, do not cut paper with your fabric scissors. Paper, although it's nice and flimsy, actually dulls your scissors, which is why your craft scissors end up dull over time. My husband knows exactly which scissors, when he goes into my craft room, he knows exactly which scissors he can touch and which scissors he can't. Okay. These are steel. These are all steel. And you will see, unlike regular scissors, which are kind of straight from the opening, dressmaking scissors will have an angle. They'll go this way and then straight. This is so that when you're cutting, you can keep this part flat along the table while you raise and lower your thumb, and this part will stay still. That way you're trying to keep the fabric as close to flat as possible when you're cutting. So that's the difference between regular scissors and dressmaking shears. The scissors are also called shears. You have 2 different kinds. You have the regular scissor kind, and you have ones like this. I don't know, can you see that? It's like a zigzaggy. There we go. Those are called pinking shears or pinking scissors. When you cut with these, you will use these to cut things out if you're worried about the fabric raveling along the edges. If you're going to wash this thing, along the edge, you will see little pieces of fabrics that can come off. If your fabric is doing that a lot, you might want to cut out your pattern pieces with the pinking shears. What it does is it adds a little zigzag along the edge so that when the fibers come off, there's extra little pieces, the little tiny pieces will come off first, and the rest of it won't ravel as badly. If you don't do that, you might have to zigzag over the edge to stop the raveling. So they're harder to cut with, they're a little harder on your hands, but they are worth it. It is worth investing in it if you're going to be sewing a lot. But you can get away with just 1 good pair. For those of you who want to know, this brand is actually called Mundial, M-U-N-D-I-A-L. But any good, heavy, solid metal pair that will hold a cutting edge will work. Okay. You can also get something called a rotary cutter, which I have a couple of different kinds here. They have a little round cutting. It's basically a round razor blade that you will roll along your fabric, and it rolls and makes the cuts. They will have some sort of guard on them so that the blades aren't sticking up. In this case, this one has a little lever that I pull the guard down, and now this part, which you should never touch these with your fingers, which is why I'm not touching them, because they are very sharp. And you can buy replacements. When they get dull, you can buy replacements at the store. But always, when you're done with these, put the blade back, or put the guard back in place over the blade. The other kind you have is this one, and it will not open until I push this little safety button, and then it will, I will be able to move it down like this. And when I let go, it pops back up. And I will always push the safety button again, and that locks it in place. If you use these, they come with several different sizes. This one is 45 millimeter. That's a standard size, the large size. They also come in smaller ones to help you get around curves, small curves. And they also come in ones that will take zigzaggy blades that will take the place of the pinking shears. Some people find this easier on their hands, especially if you have arthritis, than actual shears, because you have to just push down with your arm instead of doing this. When you use these, you will have to have a special mat to go under them. And let me grab one just a second. I'm going to try and do this without pulling my headphones off. Okay. This is called a self-healing mat. It's for use with these rotary cutters. It will not dull the blade, and they're made of kind of like I think it's made of like a silicone material, and when you roll along it, you're actually cutting down through the fabric into the mat, but it will resist. The cuts will like heal up. That's why they call it self-healing mats. This one, they are fairly expensive. I do have to warn you. The actual cutters, not too expensive. These things, a little more expensive. This one, the library owns, is huge. This one, this big one here like this will, that was loud. Sorry. This will probably cost you like $50 for this one. And you want to store them flat. Don't store them up on the edge because they will buckle and warp if you try and store them on edge. You can get one like this size. Go to Joann's during their 50% off sale or use a 50% off coupon. And you can probably get them for $25 for a decent size, which is like this. If you are not using this, if you're using just a pair of scissors, I'll show you what I use. I use this thing, which is a fold-out cardboard mat. And it has, you definitely want one that has the 1-inch grid on it so that you can cut straight lines. You can line up the edge of your fabric along one of those lines, pin it in place, and cut straight lines and things with it. This actually folds out to be about 68 inches, which is not quite 6 foot. It's like 5.5 foot. And I put that on, you can put this on your dining room table. I actually put it on the floor and just put my fabric out and cut on the floor. It's a lot easier on your knees if you do it on the rug. So, but that's useful. But you can just, you know, lay things out and cut. That's very useful though if you're wanting to line up straight. And these are rather, because they're cardboard, they're maybe $15. And you can pin straight into them because they're cardboard. If you pin into the cardboard, that may dull the tip of the pins. So have a set of pins that you, if you do that, I have a set of pins that I reserve just for pinning into the cardboard with, that I don't try and use to pin my nice fabric. Okay. Okay, so that's your cutting and things like that. You will also probably use a measuring tape to, you know, measure things. And if you use a ruler, you can do a yardstick, or you can use one of these. These are quilting rulers, and they are generally 18 inches. And they're very nice because they're see-through and you can line them up nicely on the fabric. Like if you only want to cut 1-inch strips, you can line the edge of the fabric up along this line. And then these are very easily used with the rotary cutters because you can just run the rotary cutter along the edge. If you use this with a regular ruler, a wooden one, you run the risk of, you have to be very careful because this will actually bite into your ruler and start shaving off pieces. So that's why quilters, a lot of quilters like these because they'll make nice straight lines for quilting pieces. But I like these. You will, and then that's optional, just like the rotary cutter's optional. You will need some sort of measuring thing, whether it's a yardstick or measuring tape. What is not optional is this. This is called a seam ripper. If you stitch and you decide you made a mistake, which you will make mistakes and have to eventually take something out, to unrip a stitch, you put this under the stitch in the fabric and you pop the stitch every 4 or 5 stitches, and then you can just pull the fabric apart. Don't try and run this in between the 2 layers of fabric because it has a little, this part in the center, there's a cutting blade in there. And if you roll that along there, a lot of people do because that'll cut the threads in between the fabrics. But if you're not careful, you might also cut your fabric. So what I like to do is take the pointy tip thing, and I like to just run that under a stitch every 3 or 4 stitches, pop the stitch, and then just pull them apart. Because you will, more than you like, you will make mistakes and have to use one of these. I personally own 4 because I also lose them. Okay. You will also need pins. And let me grab them. Dressmaking pins. I prefer, just for me, I prefer the kind with the little ball heads on them instead of the metal tips, the metal heads. The ones with the flat metal ends are perfectly fine and they'll work perfectly fine. I just have little fat fingers, and I tend to cut my fingernails short fairly often, so I have trouble gripping those little ones. Plus, I'm clumsy and I drop them. And when I drop them, it is easier to see the bright yellow ball on the end, which is why I prefer the bright yellow ones, but it's strictly up to you. By the way, they make these with glass balls and plastic balls. The yellow ones are plastic. Don't go over those with your iron. You'll melt them. You really shouldn't be ironing over your pins anyway. Okay. All right, so that's the basic tools that you'll need. So, stitching. I'm going to switch over to my phone, and I am going to set this stuff aside, and I'm going to move my sewing machine right here. And I'm going to grab my phone just a second so I can put it in the clamp and show you close-ups of what I'm stitching. Okay, so I am re-recording this portion of the Zoom meeting because we had technical difficulties with switching to the camera on my phone. And when we did so, for a portion of the time there, what was coming from my phone did not record. So this portion, which looks slightly different, has been inserted later. This part is where I talked about fabric and pinning. Now on your fabric has a right side and a wrong side. The right side is the bright, colorful side with the good printing. The wrong side is the dull, washed out side. Now, if you have fabric that is the same on both sides and you cannot tell the difference, then honestly, it doesn't really matter what side you consider the right side or the wrong side, as long as you pick one of those sides and make it consistently the right side for each pattern piece. When it comes to sewing, you need to know which is the right and the wrong side, because you need to sew with the right sides together, which means you have to have one. I'm going to cut a piece here. You're going to have one that's facing upward and one that's facing downward. Because when you sew these together and you turn them right side out, then the seam allowance, this part here, will be on the inside. Whereas if you sew them like this, back to back, okay, when you open it out, you're going to have the bad sides together, and the seam allowance will actually be sticking up here on the outside. So remember, right sides together. Okay. Now, when you put these together, you will line up the edges as best you can, and hopefully you've cut them straight. When you do this, you will then need to pin them together. Now, okay, you may think, oh, I can just hold these and run them through. Well, these things want to shift. Those feed dogs that come up and grip the bottom layer and pull it, if you don't have them pinned together, that top layer may not go as fast, and the bottom layer will scrunch up underneath of it, and you'll get them slightly shifting, and then you'll get wrinkly seams. So you always want to pin them before you sew the whole seam length. Then as you sew, when one of the pins gets up close to the presser foot, you'll take it out before it hits it. Now, how you pin, there are right and wrong ways to pin. I like to pin sideways like this, with the ball of the pin off to the right. Because as I feed it through, my hands are going to be in this position, feeding it through like this. And as the pin comes up close to the needle in the presser foot, I can just, while still resting this hand on here and kind of guiding it, I can reach up real quickly and pull this out as I go along, and then I can pull another one out, go along like that. So you'll want it facing to the right side, or alternatively, you can put it facing forward. I don't know if you can see that very well. Because as you go along, you can then just slide it this way. But never, ever put the pin downward. If you do that, when you get up close to the needle, let's say this is the needle, the presser foot here, you get up close to that, and then you try and pull it out, well, where's it going to go? You're going to run into that presser foot, and you're going to have to try and get it, unwedge it out of there. So do not put it downward that way. Always sideways or forward, whatever you find most comfortable. And don't let your your needle and your presser foot, don't let this go under the presser foot. Don't let you run over the pin. Some machines are not as picky as others and won't do much of anything if you run over them, but some of them it will kind of catch it, and you'll end up with wonky stitches. And of course, you always run the risk of the needle just coming down right on the pin and breaking both of them. So be careful and just take those out as you get close to the needle or the presser foot. Now you'll want to, for normal instances, you'll want to pin this, I'd say about every 6 inches or so. If your material is slippery or shiny or difficult to control, you might want to pin it closer together, like every 3 inches or 2 inches. And for velvet or something that's very slippery that wants to shift, you might even pin it every 1 inch. For velvet, though, you'll see a lot of people who swear by using little binder clips to clip on the edge, so that it's got a wider surface to clamp down, so that's less likely to shift, because velvet shifts, the layers will shift amazingly quickly. And satins and silks and any kind of shiny, slippery polyesters, make sure you pin much closer together. Okay. And now we'll go back to the regular part of the session that was pre-recorded. If you need a close-up, let me know, and I will take my camera out, or my phone out of the clamp, and put it down. All right, so I'm going to turn on my sewing machine, and my little light should have gone on. Now, I have got it set at a straight stitch, and I've got this set just a little above 2, so like 2 1/4. And remember what we learned about in the class, the first class, is that this is my reverse button. Now I'm actually going to take my thing out of the clamp, and I'm going to show you close up what this looks like. Now I'm going to use my lever to drop my presser foot down so that I'm caught under it. And give me a second, and I'm going to kind of get a nice little zoom in here. So this is how my fabric is positioned. The edge of my fabric is not at my needle. The edge of my fabric is back behind the needle by about 1/8 of an inch. I don't want to start sewing on the edge of my fabric. If I do that, it's going to catch the edge of the fabric and draw the fabric down inside that little hole, and it's going to catch it, and it's going to tear it and bind everything up. So your fabric should be about 1/8 of an inch behind your needle. I have also got this positioned so that, I don't know if you can see it, but my fabric, the edge of my fabric is right along the line that says 5/8, right here. As I'm stitching, I'm going to guide my fabric along that line, and that will give me a 5/8 inch seam allowance. If I want a skinnier seam allowance, like say a 1/4 inch, I will then line up my fabric with the edge of my presser foot, and that will give me a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it depends on what you're sewing, where you will line it up with your fabric or with your lines. If you're sewing an actual pattern, you will line it at the 5/8 inch, because most American patterns, major American patterns like Simplicity, Vogue, Butterick, McCall's, those are the 4 big ones. They all include 5/8 inch seam allowance built into the patterns. Now the kit, or the mask pattern that you all will be getting includes a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but I personally like to sew it with 1/4 of an inch to make it a little bit bigger. That's a personal preference. But so you line it up along there. Now, I am going to actually take my shoes off right now, because I am one of those people who doesn't like shoes. And I'm going to put my foot on the presser foot on the floor, and I'm going to push it down. And I like to have my shoes off so that I can feel how much I'm pushing. Okay. And each presser foot will have more or less sensitivity to it. So you'll have to get used to whatever yours is on your sewing machine. Okay, so I'm going to push it down a little bit till I just hear it going. And I take 2 stitches down and up. Then I push my reverse, take 2 more stitches, 1, 2, and then I let go. And now that is called a back stitch. I don't have to go very far, just 1 or 2 stitches back and forth, which is why you should start out very slowly at the beginning and end of every seam. You should do that slowly. If your machine tends to not want to start unless you push it really heavily, you push it a little bit till you hear it, and if it's not going, over here on this side, you will actually kind of turn that toward you, and that will usually get it started, like a little bit of a jump start, and then it should go smoothly after that. So if you're pushing and it's not wanting to move, don't just slam your foot down.
Excuse me, Cheryl.
Yeah.
Question. So is it all the time that you start and you do a couple of stitches, you will always do the reverse, a back stitch?
If you are doing a permanent seam that you do not want to come undone, okay, yes, at the beginning and end. The only time you will not is if you're doing something called a basting. And basting is when you turn the stitch lengths to where it's super long. In this case, it would be a 4. And then you don't do that at the beginning and end. And then that's when you're just wanting to sew it together temporarily, but not permanently.
Thank you.
Okay. And so as you stitch, your job is not to go quickly. Your job is to ease the fabric through. You don't pull it or push it. The little feed dogs at the bottom will come up and they will grab the fabric and pull it for you. You just need to make sure that this part here on the side, there usually is a lot more fabric over here. Make sure that's smooth and even, and kind of just gently guide it with the flat of your hand here and with this hand here, and just kind of make sure that you can move it one way or another, just to make sure that it stays lined up along that line that you're wanting to sew. So you don't want to go too fast, and when you get close to the needle or the pin, take the pin out. You do not want to sew over your pins, because some sewing machines don't mind it, and some sewing machines don't want it. Okay, I had to do something here. Sorry for the pause. Depending on your sewing machine, it may be able to go over pins, but it's best not to try. Because if it goes over and catches that pin, you can break the pin, you can break the needle, and that interrupts the flow of your sewing. Okay, so I'm going to sew a little ways away here. Just going to keep sewing, and I'm guiding it, just gently guiding it. And I am not pushing it. If I do this, it will still pull through, but it may actually wobble. So that's what I'm doing, is I'm just gently guiding it to make sure it doesn't skew. with both my hands. Now I'm going to pretend this is the end of my seam, and I'm going to push this. I'm going to take a couple of stitches backwards, and I'm going to take one more stitch forward. Now, my needle has ended up down inside my fabric. So when that happens, use this, raise up the needle. It doesn't matter whether you turn it forward or backward, just raise it up and lift up the presser foot and try and pull it out. If it's not going, so see here, I'm gently tugging and it's not coming out. That's because my needle is not fully upright. When your needle has reached the top position, it will let go. So I'm going to do this a little bit more. So, okay. So it's gone all the way to the top. Okay. Now when I pull it out, there it goes. Just gently pull it out and there it is. And so I'm going to use my scissors and I'm going to trim off close to my fabric. I like to have, actually for cutting things like this, I usually have a little tiny pair of scissors with pointy tips that I can get really in close without having to grab it with my whole hand. Just little snippers. That's what I normally use. Now, remember what we said in the first class. If you cut these threads a little too short, you can always give them just a little tug to make sure it's about 5 to 6 inches long. Because if it's too short, the next time you go to sew, it'll unthread that needle and pull it straight up. Okay. Now, so you'll see I have now stitched my 2 fabrics together. Now, when you are sewing, you will now stop and press this seam. Okay. So I am actually going to turn on my iron. I'm going to set it to cotton. And I'm going to move this out of the way, and so I don't have to move the thing. Oh boy, that gets hot on that spot. Okay. And I'm going to grab myself some fabric and pretend it's my ironing board. Because if I tried to show you my ironing board back there, I would have to readjust the handle with my phone in it, and that is not good. Okay, I have this set to cotton, and I have it set on steam. What this does is, if steam, I don't know how much you know about irons, but let's assume you don't know anything. There will be a knob that has different fabrics on it. Synthetics or polyester will be low, then you'll have silk, and then you'll have cotton, wool, and linen at the top. Because cotton, wool, and linen can take a lot more heat. And in order to get a nice crisp pressing on it, steam is useful for a lot of those fabrics. Now, if you have a delicate fabric, you might see instructions to use a pressing cloth, and maybe even a damp pressing cloth. A pressing cloth is just a piece of white cotton that you can lay down in between your nice fancy fabric and the iron, so that you don't accidentally scorch the material. If your iron doesn't have, let's say, the greatest heat settings. That's what a pressing cloth is, in case you see instructions to do that. And if you have very delicate fabric, you might want to do that. Just get a piece of white cotton and put it in between your fabric and your iron. Okay, so now when you're pressing a stitch seam that you've just done, you're not going to go like this, okay? Because you don't want to get the wrinkles out. You want to set those stitches in place. So the first thing you do is you kind of push it down, maybe give it a little wiggle, and you go up and down and just kind of set it in there. Then you will open up your fabric and you're going to do what we call finger pressing, which means you put your fingers down here, flatten it out, and just kind of try and crease it with your fingers. And then you just kind of set it and steam it in place and then let it cool. Now, if you're doing tiny stuff, your first instinct is going to be when you're working with your tip of your iron, your first instinct is going to be put your finger there to hold it in place and do this. If you do that, tilt the tip downward, because if your tip is straight, there's going to be steam coming out the side and you're going to burn the heck out of your finger. Put your finger in front, tilt the iron down so the steam is going this way, not toward your finger. And then you can do the delicate little work, always with the tip downward so that the steam is not coming out the front. You do not want to burn your fingers. Now, it's going to be very hot to start with, so just let it cool for a couple seconds. Then you can pick it up, and now you have a nice flat seam that they are now straight across. There's no wrinkles, there's no little folds, and you will do that for every seam that you stitch. And you may think, oh, that's a lot of work. I don't need to do that. Well, if you want things to look good and crisp and professional, you do. You're gonna, the way I have my stuff set up, I have my sewing machine in front of me, and I always have my ironing board to the left of me, like here at home, so that I can just sew and turn to the side and press, and sew and turn to the side and press. And your ironing board, I have my ironing board set about the height of my desk, so that I don't have to stand up or anything. I just like turn sideways and it's at the same height as my desk. And I know this is pretty obvious, but always turn this off when you're done sewing. Just safety precautions. Also, if you're not sure, there will be an opening usually right here somewhere where you put the water in. I like to use a turkey baster to put the water in there because, as I've said before, I'm clumsy. I spill things. I drop things. And a turkey baster helps me put the water in there without spilling it. That's just my little tip. Okay. I'm going to turn the iron off by turning the knob all the way down. And you should never set your iron down this way on your ironing board and leave it. You should always set it like that. Even if you've turned it off, there's still a lot of residual heat, and you can actually burn the fabric on your ironing board cover and start fires. So never set it like that and leave it. Always like that. Okay, so that's a basic stitch. Now I want to talk to you about how to turn corners, because in next week's class, we're actually going to sew an octagon. And I'm going to show you, this is one of the patterns for next week's class. This is one of the reasons why I like this pattern because it is all straight lines. There are no curves on this pattern. But it is still, it stands away from your face, and you don't have to, a lot of the ones you may see are like pleated up on the edges. A pleat is when you fold the fabric like this, that's the pleat, that's a pleat. And if you have 2 or 3 layers of fabric and you do that, it's very thick and bulky, and a lot of sewing machines don't like to sew over that. So the one we're going to be doing next week is all straight lines, no pleats, and you can use either 2 or 3 layers of the fabric. And so let me put these to the side and bring my sewing machine back. And I'm going, oops, and I have wrapped the cord around the arm of my chair. Okay. Now I'm going to talk to you about sewing corners. Okay. So I'm going to put my fabric together. Remember, right sides together. And I'm going to pin it every few inches. Okay. Now I'm going to start my stitching just like I did before. Start it, let me see, where's my presser foot? Okay. Always put your presser foot down. You should have a lever somewhere on the side or back. Always put that down, because if you try to stitch with that up, you're going to just get a huge gobs of loose thread in a big tangly knot. Oh, and always make sure that this thread that's coming off the top, that's in your actual needle, make sure that's underneath. And I know I showed you last week, but take the needle that's on the top, bring it down the little slot so that it's in the hole and coming out underneath. You always want that underneath there. If you don't do that, it's going to pull your thread in strange ways. Okay, so I'm going to stitch a couple. I'm going to push the button, stitch 2 more. Now I'm going to stitch. Now let's say what did I say about being clumsy? I just sent a pin flying. Okay. Now I'm going to go to where I want to turn a corner. Now to turn a corner, you need to make sure that your needle is down inside the fabric. This needle is not down inside the fabric. So I'm going to take, and I'm going to turn this knob forward just to bring the needle down inside the fabric. You do this because then when I lift up the presser foot, I can just pivot that fabric on the needle without losing my place. Then I put that back down and I continue sewing. Stitch a few more. Now I'm gonna take another stitch or another turn. Now, if my needle ends up down inside my fabric already, good. If it doesn't, turn the knob on the side till it's down in the fabric, turn or lift, pivot, put it back down. All right, now I'm going to take a couple stitches. I'm going to pretend this is the little, I'm done. And I'm going to make sure my needle's at the top and it's released the thread. And I'm going to cut this. All righty. So I'm going to actually cut this and trim it down so that I can show you what happens around corners. So I'm going to pretend that I have sewn my seam allowance, okay, around the fabric. So just pretend this is actually an actual fabric, okay? I have actually just trimmed it. Now, if I try to turn this right side out, if I try and turn it right side out this way, and the stitches are on the outside, I'm getting some weird bunching of the fabric in here. So if that happens and you're trying to turn it that way, what you'll need to do is trim in a kind of an angle next to that stitching. If you can see the stitching, I have trimmed close to, but not all the way up to that corner stitching, and made a kind of a little angle. That way, when I turn it, I can take something and poke the fabric right up in there, and I will have a nice sharp corner, or semi-sharp, depending on where how well I've trimmed it. And the fabric won't bunch up inside. If it's an inside corner, and I tried to turn it this way, the fabric will bunch up on the outside. Okay. And if the fabric's bunching up on the outside and it's tugging inside, so if it's an inside corner, what you'll have to do is you'll have to take a little stitch right here up to your stitching, but not cutting your threads. See that? So then if I turn this, it will actually kind of stitch, it will actually go in there nicely if I iron it down, pressing it right. So depending on whether it's an inside or an outside corner, you will either cut off the outside stitching there, or you will take a little snip into the corner this way. Because these are all outside corners and not going this way. These are outside. We're going to be, when we sew this, we're going to be snipping the outside edge like that. And that's how you do corners. So just remember, your needle has to be down in the fabric before you lift the presser foot and pivot. Then put the presser foot back down, sew, and then when you're ready, when you're done, you will trim the proper placement to make the fabric not bunch. Okay. If you see instructions that say trim the seam, what they mean is to cut away a lot of this extra fabric. You may think, okay, well, it told me to sew 5/8 inch from the edge, and now it's telling me to cut all that fabric off. Well, why didn't it just tell me to sew, you know, close to the edge? Well, because sewing real close to the edge is a little difficult, and you can't control the fabric as easily. So sometimes it will give you extra fabric to sew and then tell you to trim. And you will trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch. And if it's really bulky fabric, it may have you trim one layer 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, and one layer 1/8 of an inch. That's what they do to cut down on bulkiness in the seam. And if you do this, obviously, if it has you trim it that close, you're not going to push it open, press it open and flatten it out. You'll most likely just like flatten it to one side before you iron it. but if you're reading a pattern and it says trim the seams, that's what it means. Ripping out your stitches. What did I do with my seam ripper? There's my seam ripper. Okay. Now, like I said, some people will open this up and will start, you know, doing it from this side. I'm too clumsy. I strip my fabric. So when I do that, I cut my fabric. So you will need to find your stitches. And I don't know if it's easier to see on this side or this side. Probably on this side. Now you will have extra heavy stitch at the beginning because you back stitched. So what you'll do is you'll put your little tip right under one of those stitches and just run it up till it pops it. And you're going to do that every 4 stitches or so. And just run it along there, popping those stitches. And you will see when you open up the fabric and pull them apart, boom, they just come apart. And if you've only taken 1 or 2 back stitches, you might even find that first stitch comes out too. If you've taken more than 1 or 2, that first stitch, you may have to run it up in there and pop that extra first stitch, the back stitch. Now on one side, you will find the side that you cut, you will find little pieces of thread that you will have to go through and pull out. On the other side, you will find the thread still all in one piece and you can just pull it. Okay. And that's the simplest and the safest way to rip out your stitching. Now, does anybody have any questions? Well, if there are no questions, then I am going to turn off the recording